PNC. On behalf of the bank, thank you to the Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber for creating this opportunity to learn from each other today. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Leon John Jr. Dr. John was born in Brooklyn, New York, to the son of immigrant parents from the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. He spent his formative years in Trinidad and Tobago, but he had the best of both worlds as he spent summers and other holidays in the United States with his parents. In 1995, Dr. John moved full-time to the United States to pursue his bachelor's degree. In 2019, he graduated with a PhD in Higher Education Administration with a concentration in Human Development from Marywood University. His professional experience is exclusive to higher education, where he has worked in various departments that include enrollment management, student affairs, alumni engagement, academic affairs, and university advancement. His published dissertation, Self-Efficacy Among Students of Color at Predominantly White Institutions of Higher Education in Northeastern Pennsylvania, contains insight to the issues that the ever-increasing population of students of color face at colleges, universities in Northeastern Pennsylvania. Dr. John has delivered several presentations on the issues that students of color face on college campuses, with particular focus on implicit biases, microaggressions, and campus climate. He was the former co-chair of the Campus Climate Committee of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of East Stroudsburg University, and as an executive committee member of the NAACP Wilkes-Barre Charter number 2306. He is currently the executive director of diversity and inclusion at Cedar Crest College, an adjunct instructor at Penn State University Scranton, and is one of the three principals for Lead On Team, LLC, which specializes in consulting work and policy assessment for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the public and private sector. He lives in Pittston, Pennsylvania with his wife, Luciana, and son, Kian. Now let's hear from Dr. Leon John.
Andy, thank you for that wonderful introduction. As Andy said, my name is Leon John, and I'm the Executive Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Cedar Crest College, and also one of the principals of Lead On Team LLC that specializes in diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and other consultations and policy assessment. Today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about microaggressions in the work environment. So, who am I? I don't think I need to introduce myself anymore. Andy did a great job in introducing who I am and what I do. Today we're going to speak a little bit about microaggressions and implicit bias. We're going to define that and what that means to you. You're all here because you represent various areas of industry and nonprofits in the Wilkes-Barre and Wyoming Valley area. So you all work in various areas of industry and also in the nonprofit sector. We're also going to talk a little bit about how microaggressions are not so micro with institution policies and practices that exist in these industries, right? So a lot of policies written years and years ago when the workforce looked completely different. Today, some of these policies still exist and can be considered micro and macro aggressive. We're also going to speak today a little bit about the characteristics of microaggressions, what they mean, with giving some examples. We're going to speak about the Raven approach, and what that is basically how do we address microaggressions? And then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about scenarios and do a little bit of a share out at the very end. So first off, we're going to define what microaggressions are. Microaggressions are a brief and commonplace daily verbal or behavioral indignity, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards stigmatized or culturally marginalized groups. The best way to explain a microaggression is a paper cut. Think about this, right? You get one paper cut, and it hurts, and it stings. But then you get another paper cut, and then another one, and another one, over and over and over. After a while, that sting becomes very painful, right? So these are microaggressions, the daily slights that people from marginalized communities tend to have on a daily basis. Some of the characteristics of microaggressions are microassaults, microinsults, and microinvalidations. So let's talk about microassaults first. A microassault is explicit by nature. They could be race-based, they could be based on any other sort of marginalized community. These are the typical outbursts of racist or homophobic, transphobic, any sort of outburst that decries people from marginalized populations. Then we have microinsults. These are verbal and non-behavioral nonverbal behaviors that convey rudeness, insensitivity, and may demean someone. So these are the examples, such as if you see someone coming towards you and you don't look like them, you feel a little bit uncomfortable, so you cross the street. I'm saying you, I don't mean you, I'm just speaking about us generally, right? Because we're all guilty of microaggressive behavior. Another example is getting on an elevator. And maybe you get on an elevator and you see 3 or 4 people there that you may not feel comfortable with because they don't look like you, or you feel like they don't have anything in common with you. So then you can step off the elevator. These are nonverbal behaviors. Okay. Microinvalidations are verbal or nonverbal behaviors that exclude, negate, or nullify the thoughts of one's reality. So a great example of this is social media. We see it all the time, right? When someone makes a comment on social media, negating someone's experience, saying that something doesn't exist, someone's feelings doesn't exist, something may offend them, that's the example of a microinvalidation. I'm sure if we think about it, there are some examples of microaggressions that we can think of things that happen to us. Again, daily slights that happen on a daily basis. A lot of microaggressions tend to occur in a lot of social spaces, but they also tend to occur in spaces where there are groups of people, whether it be a professional setting, a personal setting, or again, a social setting. So they happen at dinner tables, they happen in offices, they happen at the water coolers, they happen via Zoom, right? Think about, and we're going to speak a little bit about scenarios a little bit later on, but think about logging into a Zoom meeting and you're sitting there listening to someone, and when it's your time to speak, someone turns off their camera, or they start laughing, or they do something that's physical that you can see in relation to what you're saying. That's microaggressive behavior. They may be unconscious of some of the things that they're doing, but again, they're being microaggressive towards you or towards whoever that individual is they're aiming their behavior at. I spoke a little bit about social media, but there are also other ways that we're microaggressive. I work in higher education. A perfect example is the mispronouncing of a student's name. So I teach a part-time class at Penn State Scranton, as Andy had indicated. And so at the beginning of the class, at the very first class, I go through my roster of names, and I apologize in advance to my students to let them know that I may butcher their names. Because with students, they come from all over, right? I mean, we're used to some of the names from northeastern Pennsylvania, but think about people who are not from this area, their names. So imagine someone calling you by your name incorrectly over and over and over, right? That's a classic example of a microaggression. I don't have to talk about microassaults as examples because, again, with microassaults, they are overt and they are targeted towards individuals based on a physical difference or a difference in opinion, a difference in feeling, or a difference in identity. Okay? So again, these are the 3 top examples: microassaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations. Once we get to our small group session or we get to a Q&A session, I want you to think about some examples of microaggressions that you may have experienced or that you may be the person that is microaggressive. Because again, we are used to we're going to speak a little bit about in-groups a little bit later on, but we're so used to our own social circles that when we see someone from a different social circle as we are, or a different work circle than we are, that we tend to maybe make a comment, and that may be a microaggressive comment, but we'll talk a little bit about that. So what are some of the effects of microaggressions? Well, a substantial negative impact on self-esteem and task performance. So yeah, task performance is especially important in the working world, right? So if someone is microaggressive towards you, yeah, that is going to affect the way that you work and the things that you do. It may also affect your self-esteem, which may not give you confidence in the tasks that you are doing. They can also be more harmful than overt behaviors because of the cognitive and emotional energy required to recognize, decipher, and deal with ambiguous forms of discrimination, meaning anxiety. We're just coming off of what is perhaps one of the most interesting times in our work life history, right? With COVID 19, it changed the way we work, the way we did things on a daily basis. That caused a lot of anxiety. So, on top of that, with microaggressive behaviors that we may be part of, or that we may unknowingly inflict, we may be causing anxiety to others or be the recipient of anxiety. Lower job satisfaction, poor physical health, and higher levels of depression are all attributes of microaggression as well. And again, trauma, anxiety, and in some cases, denied access of opportunity are all effects of microaggression. As I go through this, right, I want you to think of some examples, right? It may not necessarily have happened to you, but may have happened to other people, right? Or people that you're related to, friends, relatives, others, many others that this may have happened to. We cannot speak about microaggressions without speaking about implicit biases. So, what are implicit biases, right? This is where our microaggressive behavior come from. Again, I say we because we're all guilty of it. We all have implicit biases, and I just want you to know that implicit biases are unconscious by nature. So we all have them. And basically, what implicit bias is that little thing at the back of your head that when you see someone, or you hear something, or you even taste a food that is different from what you're used to, there's a judgment that formulates at the back of your head subconsciously, unconsciously, and you make a judgment about that, right? So that's one of the first characteristics of implicit bias. Everyone has them, they're pervasive. So whether or not you are a teacher, or you work in law enforcement, you are part of the media, you are a judge or a civil servant, you work in an office building, you work in a health facility, no matter who you are, if you're a parent, if you're a spouse, if you're a partner, you have implicit biases because you are part of a specific in group, right? You belong to an in group, which is the second characteristic of implicit bias. In groups are people that we associate ourselves with based on the way that we grew up, based on our surroundings, based on our family, based on our friends. There's a saying that the Jesuits have from the time you're 7 years old, show me the child and I'll show you the adult. And the reason being that there has been research that says between the ages of 7 and 12, you have already formulated your own biases. And again, why is that? It's based on the people that are that surrounds us, right? So all of our values, all of our opinions, our likes, our dislikes, that's formulated based on the people that we surround ourselves with. Now, as we grow older and if we move out or if we move on and go somewhere else, then we find a new social group, right? And so we have new beliefs. But again, that's your in group. So think about it this way, right? If I say something about the Bronx, what do you think of? If I say something about Brooklyn, New York, what do you think of? If I say inner city Philadelphia, what pictures come in your head? Again, I'm using very urban areas. How about California, Miami, rural Pennsylvania, Mashopin, Nicholson, Tunkhannock? What are some of the pictures that enter your head and why is that, right? So again, one of the characteristics of implicit bias are they are in-group based. The good thing about some of these implicit biases are that they can be unlearned, right? And the only way you do that is through reflection and other debiasing techniques, such as what you're doing now, which is DEI training or educational development, self research, and self reflection, right? So self research, we live in a time where you can find the answer to anything with literally the click of a button, right? So if you hear something that you may not agree with, or you want a different perspective, or you want to know why people are behaving a certain way, that people who do not look like you, feel free to do some of your own research. talk to some other people who may not look like you, who may be experiencing the same things that they are, right? Self reflection. Next time you hear inner city Philadelphia and you form a judgment in your head, not saying that you are, but if that's the case, think about why you feel that way, right? I'm sure if I see New Jersey drivers, some of you may either laugh, roll your eyes, or just kind of cringe at the thought of driving in New Jersey. Again, why is that? Those are stereotype based, which we're going to talk about, but they start with implicit biases, and that is the root of microaggressions. So we spoke a little bit about implicit biases, but again, one of the causes of microaggressions are stereotypes. So a stereotype, as opposed to an implicit bias, is explicit and a result of conscious, intentional, and controllable thoughts and beliefs. Stereotypes can be positive, neutral, or negative. Stereotypes are rooted in that in-group, societal-based belief. Stereotypes are also formulated because of biases, outward biases that we may have towards specific groups of people, again, towards specific food or religion or political affiliations. You name it, there's a stereotype for it or a bias for it. Three examples of stereotypes I'd like to speak about today are gender profiles, racial profiles, and group profiles, because these are three of the biggest types of stereotypes that exist in our society. Gender profiles, gender identity profiles, and one of the easiest types of examples I wanted to go with today is the male role versus female role in the household. A stereotype that has existed maybe since the beginning of time. Don't quote me on that, I do not know that for sure. But it certainly feels that way, right? So why is it there's a stereotype that exists about what a female needs to be doing in a household versus what a male should be doing in a household? Stereotype. A racial profile is based on ethnicity. We hold stereotypes against certain groups simply because of the fact that they may not look like us, they may not be from the same city we are, they may not be from the same country we are, they may not be from the same part of the world we are. But the number one reason maybe is because they do not look like us, right? And by us, I mean whoever the general population is, whoever your general population of your in-group is. And then we have group profiles that's based on physical attributes. So the disabled community, elderly drivers, a person who wears all black, people who dress differently. These are groups that we may hold stereotypes against. Remember, stereotypes are explicit as opposed to implicit bias. And one of the things I'd like to go back to talk about implicit bias, one of the things that we need to remember is that, or need to know, is that we can be explicitly unbiased and still have implicit bias. We may think that we are not biased towards a specific group or a specific type of something else, but we may certainly hold biases. Just because you have a friend who's a different race as you are, just because you have a friend who's a different religion as you are, just because you go to a different type of restaurant once a month does not make you unbiased. Again, I say you, I mean all of us, because we're all guilty of this implicit bias, right? So just remember that. Just because we have friends, family, and other people in our lives that are different than us does not mean that we cannot be biased against them. So, addressing microaggressions. Again, I'm breezing through this in half hour. We could spend all day, but they told me I only have like 30 minutes to talk to you about microaggressions. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about how you can address some of these microaggressive behaviors. So if you're sitting in a group and something happens, what do I do, right? So we do what's called the Raven approach. So the first part is redirect, intervene, correct, or pull aside. You'll know the situation, you'll know what's appropriate, right? So intervening, meaning if you see someone that is the target of microaggressive behavior and they feel that they're being attacked, intervene if you can. Stand in between them and the person who is being microaggressive. you can correct that individual as well, or you can pull aside. It's all situational based, right? Again, sometimes the people who are being microaggressive are not aware they're being microaggressive. One of my favorite examples is when someone tells me that I speak well. What does that even mean, right? Or you're so eloquent, or you're well spoken. I don't know what that means. I would hope that I am, right? But this is an example of a microaggression. Ask a question. So, probing questions for clarity. I have some examples. I think I heard you say, what did you mean by that? Or, I want to make sure I understand that you were saying what you were saying. Were you saying that? And I'll give you a perfect example. Like I said, I teach a class at Penn State Scranton. I've been teaching for over 12 years now. During a class, I was just doing my lecture, and then I made a joke, and then someone laughed out. The entire class laughed, and then a student, after laughing, is like, "Oh, Dr. John, that's so gay." And so I was struck with, well, what do I do in my head? I'm like, do I tell the student that's inappropriate in front of his peers? Do I correct the student? Do I pull the student aside after class? Well, what actually happened was someone who was sitting next to the student, who was one of his friends, said, "Hey, what do you mean by that? Did you say that that was gay? What did you mean?" Right? And then the student, not knowing that he had bellowed that out, not knowing that it was microaggressive behavior, because again, it's part of maybe his daily vernacular, not daily, but maybe part of his vernacular, then he just said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and apologized, realizing his mistake. Right? So that's a perfect example. Always ask, always be clear, give clarification, value, right? Make sure there's a value in addressing microaggressions. So, in this office, we work hard to create a space that is safe and welcoming for all employees, right? So, reiterate that. What you just said is not in alignment with what we believe here, right? So again, these are for those really micro assaults that are hurtful and hateful. Emphasize your own thoughts and feelings. If someone is microaggressive towards you, and again, this does not just apply to work, this applies to your daily lives as well. When I hear your comments, I feel. Many people may take that to mean, and that's what happened in this situation with this student, right? So you said that that joke was gay. What that made, other people may take that as a completely different way than what you meant it. And then, of course, if that individual cares to talk about their experiences, they can. And then always think about the next steps. Now, sometimes we're in situations where we may be part of microaggressive behavior, we may witness microaggressive behavior, we may be the target of microaggressive behavior. And then at the time, we're like, wow, this sucks, but I'm gonna power through it. And then we go home or we go wherever, and then we think about it. And we're like, you know what, I should have said this, or I should have done that, or I should have said that, this is unacceptable. Well, you can the next time, because let me tell you, microaggressive behavior happens every day. So the next time something like that happens, you'll know how to say it and how to address it. So what I'd like to do now, I know I have 30 minutes and we're coming close to that time. And we have a little bit of time for discussion afterwards. I have presented 3 scenarios which I'd like to discuss. I also asked you to think during my talk about some of the microaggressive behaviors that you may have been a part of, or maybe you were the one being microaggressive and may not have realized it, so that we could talk about it, right? So this is our first scenario. During our department meetings on Zoom, one person tends to dominate and monopolize the meeting time. She speaks more than others, and every time I talk, she interrupts me. I notice too that when others talk, that she often puts her hand over her mouth, as though she's trying to hide her expressions. It appears as though she's laughing while others are talking, and especially when I am talking. So that's the first scenario. Scenario 2. Because I'm very concerned about COVID due to a pre-existing condition, let's just say COVID-19, I apologize, I am trying my best to limit myself to others in the office, physically. I've made it known to the people I work with that I'm not able to participate in social gatherings. However, I receive emails on a regular basis asking me to attend events as a representative of my department or to meet in person in the office. When I hesitate, I am told they will find someone else who is able to attend the event and make comments that make me feel that they believe I should put my job before my health. I feel that I may be in danger of losing my job. And then the third scenario, I'm a new employee, not from the immediate area. I sometimes feel left out of conversations when I'm in meetings. The other employees talk about things that I don't know about. They talk about things that they have worked on together in the past and make comments like, we know what happens when we do that, or we know what happened last time and we tried this. They talk about people I don't know and procedures I don't understand. I don't say anything because I don't want to interrupt the meeting or sidetrack the agenda. So, these are three scenarios I'd like to discuss now during our Q&A session, or we could speak a little bit more about microaggressions and some of the microaggressions we may have, some of the microaggressive behavior we may be a part of. Before I leave, I want to give you a perfect example, so this may be able to start the conversation of some of the microaggressive behavior that I am guilty of, okay? So during my introduction that Andy was able to share with you, he said I'm from Brooklyn, New York, right? And I grew up in the Caribbean. When I moved here when I was 17 years old, I was, it was culture shock to me because moving from the Caribbean to northeastern Pennsylvania was a complete culture shock, right? So I like pizza, being from Brooklyn, right? Love pizza. Should be a food group, as I'm sure most of you agree. Now, I remember getting this thing called Old Forge pizza, right? Everyone told me I had to try it. So I did. And then when I went to, and I'm not going to say the name of the restaurant, and I opened up the box and I looked in, it was square, and it didn't look like pizza to me. And I ate it, I'm like, wow, this is not pizza. So I had a bias towards that, right? And I say this jokingly, but that's an example of microaggressive behavior. I had a bias, an implicit bias about pizza, about what I think pizza should look like. And then as I ate it, I was not liking it. I've come to since appreciate it, but I still don't think it's pizza. I thank you so much for your time. Again, my name is Leon John. It says that I'm the principal, one of the principals of Lead On Team. That's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. I'm looking forward to hearing some of your questions.